We are talking about special education evaluations. So here we have three truths and one not so true statement. Do you know which ones are which? Let me read them to you because I know the font is small. Number one, districts can't deny a parent's request for an evaluation meeting. Do you think that's true or not so true? How about number two? Districts can decide your child no longer needs special education services. True? I don't know. Three, there are times when the district can evaluate your child without your permission. True or not? Four, assessments need to address your child's strengths and needs. So, what do you think? We are going to be talking about these questions and even more while we do our free training today on YouTube. So, if you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, do that. And you can also click on that little red bell and you'll get notification when I'm going live. If you are new to our show, I am Charmaine Tanner. I am a retired teacher. I was both a special ed teacher and a classroom teacher. I have a son, Dylan, who received inclusive special ed services throughout school. And I'm also a host for this weekly YouTube show and a professional advocate. So I work with a lot of families around the country and learning how to be a more effective advocate for their child so their kids can be happy and safe and learning every day in school, because that's our ultimate goal, right? So if you missed the show last week, we did part one about evaluations. Today is our part two, and we're going to be looking at some commonly asked questions that I get about evaluations. So let's dive into our first question. My son, I need to show that to you. That would be helpful. My son is having his first special education evaluation. How long does the school have to finish the testing? Great question. So many parents, I think, have heard about the 60-day calendar rule. However, you need to know that there can be exceptions in your state. So, for instance, in Idaho, the 60-day calendar rule has an exception for school vacations. So if a school is not going to be in session for at least 5 consecutive days, then that calendar time frame stops and picks back up again when school starts. So you need to know what your own state regulations are about the time frame, and make sure you also find out if it's the same time frame for reevaluations as it is for initial evaluations, because often they will have different time frames that they have to follow. So let's keep exploring here. The other thing that I notice is kind of a misconception is that parents think that the assessments have to be done within that 60 calendar days, when in fact the federal regs talk about not only do you have to have the assessments completed, but you also have to determine eligibility, which means you have to have an eligibility meeting within those 60 calendar days. So it's not just the testing. They also have to invite you to an eligibility meeting within those 60 days. Another tip is to know that that clock doesn't start until you've signed that official district's consent for evaluation form. Sometimes parents will email saying, I give consent for a special ed evaluation, and they think, okay, it's all set up now. No, you need to go back in and make sure you have a meeting with the team, talk about what, assessments that look like they are necessary, and sign the official consent form before that clock will actually start ticking. If you would love to get an ebook about this topic, just let me know in the comments, because what I do is I turn the presentation into an ebook that then you can use for a reference. You can download it. You can just keep it on your computer. So if you're interested in that, just type the word ebook down below. A second question is, I haven't given consent for the district to reevaluate my child. Is it true that the district can't do it then? So let's look. According to federal regulations, you have to, it does allow districts permission to reevaluate your child, even if you haven't signed the consent form, if they have documentation that they've taken all kinds of reasonable measures to, reach you and to get your, response. So if a parent doesn't respond and the district keeps trying and the parent doesn't respond, the federal regulations do give the district permission to reevaluate your child. And again, this is reevaluate. Know that there's a difference with initial evaluations as opposed to reevaluation. So you want to keep that really clear in your mind, because the timelines are different and what the district can do, whether or not you consent to an initial, whether or not you consent to a reevaluation are different. So you really want to be knowledgeable about that, or have someone that you can ask those questions to. Now, another parent asked me, she said, the special ed teacher said my daughter doesn't need to continue to have special ed services. Can the school just decide that? Well, I have heard from more than one family that I've worked with that it seems like sometimes teachers will say, I think your child's progressing really well. I don't think an IEP is needed. Maybe we can look at a 504 plan. And they'll say, we'd like you to come to an IEP team meeting so we can talk about this. They bring you into the IEP meeting, but there's really no, new evaluation data to show whether or not your child is still eligible for special ed services. So that's the missing piece. Before you go to that IEP meeting to talk about whether or not your child will be exited from special ed services, you want to make sure that there is a reevaluation done. Your child's eligibility for special education cannot just be stopped by an IEP team saying, yeah, we don't think these are needed anymore. You have to have that other step in there where a reevaluation is done on your child. So that's like one of the things that's like super important. You need to talk to the team. Sometimes the teachers don't understand that the need for a reevaluation has to be one of those steps. Again, if you want that ebook. Another question came in and it says, why do all the assessments focus on what my son can't do? And I think this is like so common when we go to IEP or ARD meetings, is after an evaluation has been done, there's just this long list of things that your child cannot do. And it's like pretty depressing, right? It can feel like this doom and gloom kind of part of the meeting. And instead, what we want to have that conversation about is talking about the importance of also identifying your child's strengths, how they learn best through that evaluation. It's not just a laundry list of what your child can't do. And I think what happens is we have to look at the perspective of the people that are doing the assessment, because often those teachers or psychologists or whatever are trained from this medical model point of view. And what they see their responsibility is to find out what's wrong with your child and come up with a plan to fix what is wrong. And instead, we want to shift that culture and we want to look at identifying strengths. And if you look in the federal regulations, it talks about the purpose of assessments will be something that's going to inform what gets written in the IEP. So we know in the IEP, there has to be strengths listed in the IEP. There's a section for present level of performance. Though that is another place where you want to talk about what your child's strengths are in the variety of areas. And then also when we look at accommodations later in the meeting, we want to be able to know what your child's strengths are, how they learn best, so we can incorporate that into the accommodation section too. So we want to get away from only focusing on what your child is, struggling with, to how can we teach them new skills and concepts through their strengths. And so that strength-based evaluation, and that will lead to a strength-based IEP, which I think is like the way we need to be rolling. Another question is, I heard someone say that if I requested special education testing for my child, a district could refuse my request. And it's like, what? How many times have you heard from other parents? All you have to do is put it in writing, tell them that you want this assessment done, and they have to do it. And guess what? That isn't true. The district can refuse your request for testing. Now, I'm not sure that happens real often. However, this past spring, I had a parent that hired me to be an advocate to come to meetings because that very thing had been happening all year, where the school was refusing to evaluate her son. They're like, oh, he'll grow out of it. He's young. He's a boy. I don't really see that much, kind of negative impact at school. We think we'll just keep trying what we're doing here at school. Well, month after month after month goes on, and the child is still struggling. Still, there is just something not clicking, and the mom keeps asking for an evaluation. Well, finally in the spring, when she hired me, we were able to sit down with the team. She had gotten a private evaluation to show the learning challenges that her son was having. And finally, we got the district to agree to consent for that evaluation. But you have to know that they always have that prerogative to deny your request. And then you have to keep on that advocacy path, right, to change that. So if we look at some of the things here, one of the obligations that the evaluation team has, and you have to remember that you're a member of that evaluation team, is to look at previous information that the district has, and to see if a new assessment would be needed. Sometimes the school team will say, we have enough information. We don't think the child would be eligible. We're not going to do the testing. You want all of that verbiage reduced to writing in a prior written notice. So if the district refuses your request, make sure you respond with, please send me a prior written notice explaining your decision. And that's what they have to do. They have to tell you in that prior written notice what information they considered, why they came to the conclusion of an assessment is not needed at this time. You want that captured because that's going to be part of your paper trail as to why this request was refused. And so often I think parents just hear the answer no, and they don't understand that you do have to get a prior written notice with the district explaining that. They can't simply say no to your request and drop it all together. And so let's continue on. Our next question: how many tests does the school really have to give my son to see if they're eligible for special ed services? And this is like, yikes. In this age of test, we want to make sure that our kids only are taking tests that, one, are going to give us useful information and that will tell us the child's strengths along with their needs. But we also want to make sure that it's not too much testing. So I have this little rule that I give myself. Oh, before we talk about the rule, I forgot. Yes, the district has an obligation. They're going to review the current records. They're going to assess in all areas of suspected disability. So this is a part where you want to be able to know what tests you already have, had done for your child. So if a private SLP or occupational therapist has done some testing, make sure you share that with the district, right? Because they don't want to duplicate testing that's already been done. You're not going to get valid results if you duplicate testing that was recently done. So share that information. But then you also have an obligation as a member of the evaluation team to talk with the staff and say, we really want to look at all the areas that, we think, that he's struggling in, and we do want to get some valuable information in those areas. So the rule that I've developed, it's not really my rule, but I call it the Goldilocks rule. And this is to make sure that we don't have too much testing going on or not enough evaluation information, but just the right amount. We don't want your child to be over or under tested. We want just the amount of information and tests that we need to develop a good IEP for your child, because that's what the evaluation information is going to lead up to. It's going to lead up to a new IEP. And if you want the ebook, make sure you let us know. Here's another question. Can a district file for a due process hearing if I refuse to let them test my child? So I think it was last week's show, we were talking about you only have to give consent for the tests that you agree to. For our family, we never agreed or gave consent for IQ tests for our son. So we would not sign that part of the consent form. We'd not agree to that, but we would agree to if he needed an updated speech language assessment. Well, there are some states, and one mom wrote in from California saying, out here, if parents don't sign consent, one of the common practices is districts file for due process hearings. And so as a parent, you have to know these kinds of things are possible because you want to be strategizing what you're going to do next if the district would file for due process if you deny consent. So all of these things you need to weigh out. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's really helpful for parents to work with advocates, because you want another person to strategize with. And you want to be able to predict what's going to happen and what, your reaction or how you can be proactive to that and stop that from happening. And as a parent by yourself going to a meeting, that can be really difficult to do. So, the rule of thumb is to always take someone with you. If you can have an advocate with you, that works even better. Because that's an experienced person that can really help you learn how to be a more effective advocate for your own child. So let's look here. Now, this is talking about an initial evaluation. So if your child is just going into that special ed journey. And if you refuse to consent for that initial evaluation, the district could file for a due process hearing. And if the hearing officer rules that they think the school assessment plan is appropriate, and if the parents don't appeal that decision, then the district legally can evaluate your child. And it doesn't mean that automatically districts are going to file for due process unless you live in some districts like there are in California. Because the other part of the federal regulations that helps the school is it says if parents refuse consent for that initial evaluation, the school district can decide not to pursue anything. And they also have the protection to know that they're not obligated to provide your child a free, appropriate public education if you've denied consent. So these kinds of decisions that you make around evaluation are super important because it can change the whole direction of how things are going to go as far as the services and supports that your child can or won't get in the public school system. So we want to keep those kind of in the forefront of our thinking. And now let's go back to these 3 truths and the one that's not so true, and if we can figure out which is which. So let's go through these one at a time. The first one is, let me get my glasses on. The first one says districts can deny a parent's request for an evaluation. And we learned, yes, that is true. They can do that. The second one is districts can decide your child no longer needs special education services. And this is the one that's not so true, because they need to have that step in there where your child is reevaluated before any decision is made by the IEP team whether or not your child is still eligible for special ed services. So if they're thinking of exiting your child, they have to do a reevaluation first. Our third one was, there are times when the district can evaluate your child without your permission. And we found out that that's true, right? So you need to be thinking about that and what the consequences of that decision are going to be for you. And obviously for your child, right? Number 4, assessments need to address your child's strengths and needs. And this is true. Even though we hear more about our child's needs and what they can't do, we want assessments to also be identifying your child's strengths. So again, I will send out an ebook for this training. If you're interested in that, let us know in the comments here on our YouTube channel. And here we go, our 3 truths and that one that isn't so true. So thank you for joining us today on our YouTube channel. When you are watching the replay, know that you can still come back here and type in comments or ask questions, because I'll be checking back and responding to you. So I am Charmaine Tanner. Thank you for being here with us. As an advocate, one of my main goals is to help you become a more effective advocate for your child, so your child gets the education that they deserve. So until next Thursday, we shall see you, and take care.